September 30th, 1956. 6:47 p.m. The Casbah, Algiers. Captain Jean-Marie Gourlin stands at a café table on Rue Randon, watching the narrow street fill with evening shadows. His coffee has gone cold. He doesn't notice. His eyes track a woman in a white hike, the traditional Algerian head covering, as she moves through the crowd with a wicker basket balanced on her hip. She looks like every other woman in the Casbah. That's the problem. Gourlin is commander of a paratrooper section in the 10th Parachute Division, France's elite airborne force. These men jumped into Suez, fought in Indochina, earned their reputation in blood. They're trained to assault fortified positions, to fight conventional armies, to win battles. But there are no battles in the Casbah. Just women with baskets and men drinking mint tea, and children playing in alleyways that twist like intestines through the ancient quarter. Somewhere in this maze, the enemy is planning the next attack. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 500 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Please subscribe to my channel, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now let's continue. The woman with the basket turns a corner and vanishes. Gourlin drains his cold coffee and signals his sergeant. Time to move. The patrol forms up. 8 paratroopers in camouflage fatigues, M80-49 submachine guns held at the ready, walking in a formation designed for urban combat. They look like conquerors. They feel like blind men. The Casbah rises above the harbor in a vertical labyrinth of whitewashed buildings stacked against the hillside like children's blocks. Streets become staircases. Staircases become tunnels. Tunnels open into courtyards that connect to 3 other streets through passages so narrow a man has to turn sideways to pass. The French paratroopers have maps. The maps are useless. Every corner could hide a rifle. Every rooftop could conceal a spotter. Every woman, every child, every old man selling oranges could be FLN, the National Liberation Front fighting to free Algeria from 126 years of French colonial rule. Or they could just be civilians trying to survive. There's no way to tell the difference. Gourlin's patrol moves deeper into the Casbah. The buildings press closer. The streets get narrower. Laundry hangs overhead like flags of surrender. The smell of cumin and sewage and humanity hangs thick in the air. People watch from doorways with expressions that reveal nothing. The paratroopers are carrying the finest military equipment France can provide. They have radio communications, armored vehicles waiting at the perimeter, air support on call. They have training from the best military academies in Europe. And they're losing. Not in any way their training prepared them for. There are no enemy formations to destroy, no territory to capture and hold. The FLN doesn't wear uniforms or masks for conventional assault. They blend into the civilian population like sugar dissolving in tea. Last week, a bomb destroyed the Milk Bar Café on Place Bugade, the European quarter where French colonists sip apéritifs and pretend Algeria is just another province of France. 3 dead, dozens wounded. The bomber was a young woman in a summer dress who looked like she belonged there. 2 days ago, grenades were thrown into a restaurant. Yesterday, a police commissioner was shot in his car at a traffic light. The French military response has been overwhelming. Thousands of troops flood Algiers. Checkpoints on every major road. Patrols through every neighborhood. Mass arrests. Interrogations. And still the attacks continue. Because the FLN isn't fighting a military war. They're fighting a political one. Every French soldier in the streets reminds Algerians they're occupied. Every checkpoint is a humiliation. Every arrest creates a new sympathizer. The paratroopers don't understand this yet. They're still thinking in terms of firepower and tactical superiority. Gourlin's patrol reaches a small square where old men sit at a fountain, smoking and playing dominoes. The conversation stops when the soldiers appear. The silence is thick enough to cut. "Papers," Gourlin says in French. The old men don't move. One of them, gray beard, calloused hands, looks at Gourlin with eyes that have seen empires come and go. "We live here," the man says in perfect French. "We've always lived here. Your papers." Now, the old man slowly reaches into his jalaba and produces an identity card. Gourlin examines it. Everything is in order. Of course it is. Everything is always in order. The card tells him nothing. It doesn't say whether this man shelters FLN fighters, whether he passes messages, whether his grandson is in the mountains with the guerrillas, whether his daughter carries bombs in her shopping basket. Gorlin hands back the card and moves on. Behind him, the domino game resumes. The old men don't acknowledge the patrol's departure. They just continue their game as if heavily armed foreign soldiers patrolling their neighborhood is perfectly normal. Because it is normal now. This is what occupation looks like. 3 blocks deeper into the Casbah, Gorlin's radio crackles. Command wants a status report. He keys the mic. Sector 7 clear. No contact. Proceeding to. The explosion cuts him off. It's not close, maybe 4 or 5 blocks away, but in the Casbah's acoustic maze, sound bounces and distorts until you can't tell direction or distance. The blast echoes off stone walls, followed by screaming and the sharp crack of rifle fire. Gorlin's patrol breaks into a run, weapons raised, trying to navigate streets they don't know toward a threat they can't see. They'll be too late. They're always too late. That's the genius of FLN tactics: strike fast, disappear faster, leave the French chasing ghosts. September 30th, 1956. 7:03 p.m. 4 blocks away. The woman with the wicker basket is named Zora Driff. She's 22 years old, a law student at the University of Algiers, daughter of a respected family. She wears lipstick and European-style clothes when she moves through the French Quarter. In the Casbah, she covers herself traditionally. Right now, she's climbing a staircase carved into the hillside, counting her steps. 42 to the blue door. Knock 3 times, pause, knock twice. The door opens immediately. Inside, 5 people wait in a room barely large enough for them all. No introductions. No real names. They know each other only by their roles in the network. The bomb maker, the courier, the lookout, the safe housekeeper. Zora sets down her basket. Beneath the vegetables and bread are 3 glass bottles filled with a mixture of potassium chlorate and sugar, wrapped in cloth to prevent clinking. Crude bombs, but effective enough. The patrol just passed Rue Randon, she says. They'll be in Sector 7 for another 20 minutes. The bomb maker, a thin man with chemical burns on his hands, nods. That gives us the window. This is how the FLN operates. Not as an army, but as a cellular network where each person knows only their immediate contacts. If Zora is captured, she can't betray the entire organization because she doesn't know the entire organization. She knows these 5 people and the courier who gives her assignments. That's all. The French call it terrorism. The FLN calls it revolutionary warfare. The distinction matters less than the results. A colonial power with overwhelming military superiority is being bled by an enemy it can't find, can't fight, and can't defeat with conventional tactics. The safe housekeeper, an older woman named Fatima, brings mint tea. This detail would seem absurd to French military planners. Revolutionaries pausing for tea in the middle of planning an attack. But that's the point. They're not soldiers on a battlefield. They're people living their lives, and the resistance is woven into the fabric of that life. The target is the Coke Hardy restaurant, the bomb maker says, unfolding a hand-drawn map. European clientele, officers frequent it. High visibility, maximum political impact. Zora studies the map. She's memorizing the route, the timing, the escape plan. Nothing will be written down. If she stopped and searched, the French will find a young woman carrying groceries, nothing more. The lookout, a teenage boy named Farid, is already at his position 3 streets away, watching the patrol routes. He has a simple signal system. If he sees French troops approaching, he'll hang a red shirt from his window. If the route is clear, nothing. No radio communications to intercept. No written orders to discover. Just people who know their roles and trust each other with their lives. Outside, Captain Gorlin's patrol is still running toward the earlier explosion. A small incendiary device set in a trash bin, designed to draw security forces to one sector while operations happen in another. Misdirection. Always misdirection. At 7:15 p.m., Zora leaves the safe house carrying a different basket. This one contains the bombs, wrapped now in layers of cloth and nestled among actual groceries she purchased that morning. She's changed into a yellow dress, European style, fashionable, the kind worn by French women in the colonial quarter. She's transformed herself from an Algerian in traditional dress to a modern young woman who could be anyone. The French checkpoints are looking for suspicious Arabs. They're not looking for a pretty girl in a sundress carrying groceries. This is psychological warfare refined to its essence. Zora walks through a checkpoint at the edge of the Casbah. The French soldier barely glances at her. She smiles, not too warm, not too cold, and he waves her through. His training never covered this scenario. How do you stop an insurgency when the insurgents look like the people you're supposed to protect? The answer is you can't. Not with military force alone. 3 blocks into the European quarter, the architecture changes. Gone are the narrow medieval alleyways of the Casbah. Here the streets are wide, tree-lined, designed by French urban planners who wanted to recreate Paris on the Mediterranean coast. Cafes spill onto sidewalks. European women in summer dresses shop at boutiques. French officers in uniform sit at outdoor tables, drinking wine, laughing. They feel safe here. The Casbah is contained, controlled, saturated with patrols. The attacks happen over there, in the Arab quarter. Not here. Zora approaches the Coke Hearty restaurant at 7:32 p.m. She can see through the windows. White tablecloths, crystal glasses, French families enjoying dinner. A waiter in a bow tie carries a tray of champagne flutes. Someone is celebrating a birthday. She can see the cake being brought to a table where a little girl claps her hands with delight. For a moment, just a moment, Zora hesitates. Then she remembers the French paratroopers kicking down doors in the Casbah at 3 a.m., dragging men from their beds. She remembers her cousin who disappeared into a detention center and came back broken, unable to speak about what happened. She remembers 126 years of colonial rule that treated Algerians as subjects, not citizens. She sets the basket down near the entrance, adjusts her dress, and walks away. Her pace is measured. Not too fast. Not too slow. Just a young woman who realized she forgot something at home. Behind her, the basket sits innocuously among the evening foot traffic. 7 minutes. That's how long the timer will give her to get clear. The bomb maker calibrated it precisely. Long enough for escape, short enough that no one will notice an abandoned basket before it's too late. Zora is 3 blocks away when the explosion shatters the evening. The blast wave blows out the restaurant's windows, scattering glass across the sidewalk like diamonds. The noise is tremendous, a physical force that stops conversation for 6 blocks in every direction. Then the screaming starts. Back at the Casbah checkpoint, Captain Gorlin hears the explosion. His radio erupts with frantic calls. Officers down. Civilians wounded. Unknown number of casualties. He's running again, his entire patrol running toward another attack they couldn't prevent. This is the pattern. The French react while the FLN acts. Always one step behind, always arriving after the damage is done, always questioning civilians who saw nothing, know nothing, say nothing. By the time Gorlin's men reach the Coke Hearty, Zora is back in the Casbah, changed into traditional dress, indistinguishable from 10,000 other women in white hikes. She climbs to a rooftop where she can see the European quarter below. Emergency vehicles are converging on the restaurant. Ambulances. Fire trucks. Military patrols establishing a perimeter. Too late. Always too late. This isn't her first attack. It won't be her last. The FLN strategy is clear. Make the French presence unbearable. Make French civilians question whether Algeria is worth the cost. Make French soldiers understand that their superior firepower means nothing when the enemy is everywhere and nowhere. October 7, 1956. 2 a.m. French military headquarters, Algiers. Colonel Roger Trinquier hasn't slept in 36 hours. His desk is covered with incident reports, intelligence summaries, and maps marked with red pins. Each pin representing an FLN attack in the past month. There are too many pins. Trinquier is a veteran of Indochina, where he watched France lose another colonial war to an enemy that refused to fight conventionally. He learned hard lessons in the jungles of Vietnam. He's determined not to repeat those mistakes in Algeria. But first, he has to convince his superiors to abandon everything they think they know about warfare. "We're fighting the wrong war," he says to the assembled officers. Most of them are conventional military thinkers, men who earned their ranks in World War II, who understand armies and front lines and territorial objectives. Trinquier taps the map. The FLN doesn't hold territory. They don't mass for battle. They exist as a network, cells within cells, compartmentalized, resilient. We can kill 100 of them, and the network regenerates. We can arrest 1,000 suspects, and the attacks continue. A general interrupts. Then we arrest 10,000. We flood the Casbah with troops. We establish total control. We have total control, Trinquier says quietly. Look at the map. We have checkpoints, patrols, armored vehicles. We control every major street. And they're still bombing restaurants in broad daylight. The room falls silent. Trinquier continues. They're not winning militarily. They're winning politically. Every bomb reminds the French public that Algeria is unstable. Every attack makes our presence seem futile. They're not trying to destroy our army. They're trying to destroy our will to stay. He pulls out a document, intercepted FLN propaganda. They're explicit about this. Quote, "We don't need to defeat France militarily. We need to make the occupation too expensive to sustain. Every French soldier in Algeria costs money. Every attack costs political capital. Eventually, France will decide we're not worth the price." Another officer speaks up. "So what do you propose?" Trinquier unfolds a new map. This one shows the Casbah divided into sectors, subsectors, blocks, buildings. Every structure numbered. Every residence catalogued. "We fight network with network," he says. "We map the entire Casbah. Every building, every resident, every family connection. We assign each sector to a specific officer who learns his territory intimately. We don't patrol randomly. We gather intelligence systematically. We identify the support network that makes FLN operations possible." "That's not warfare," someone mutters. "That's police work." "Exactly," Trinquier says. "This is a police operation with military support, not a military operation with police support. The sooner we understand that, the sooner we can adapt. But adaptation requires tactics the French military has never employed on this scale. Tactics that will blur the line between security and oppression. Tactics that will win battles and lose the moral war." Trinquier doesn't see it yet. None of them do. October 8, 1956. 7:30 a.m. The Casbah. The new strategy begins with a census. French paratroopers move through the Casbah building by building, apartment by apartment. They're not looking for weapons or FLN members. Not yet. They're gathering data. Every resident is photographed. Every occupant catalogued. Family relationships mapped. Employment recorded. Daily routines noted. To the French officers, this is intelligence gathering, understanding the human terrain the same way they'd study geographical terrain before a conventional battle. To the Algerians, this is the tightening of a noose. Captain Gourlin stands in a cramped apartment while his men photograph a family. Father, mother, 3 children. The father works as a baker. The mother doesn't work outside the home. The children attend French schools. Nothing suspicious. Nothing to indicate FLN involvement. But Gourlin notes that the baker's shop sits at a key intersection in Sector 4. He notes that the oldest son is 17, prime recruitment age. He notes that the mother's brother lives 3 buildings away and wasn't home when they knocked. Every detail recorded. Every connection mapped. Within 2 weeks, the French will have a database of over 60,000 Casbah residents. They'll know who's related to whom, who works where, who visits which mosque, who drinks at which cafe. They're building a picture of the network from the outside in. But the FLN is already adapting. In a safe house deep in the Casbah, Youssef Sidi, the FLN zone commander for Algiers, is briefing his cell leaders. He's 29 years old, a former baker turned revolutionary commander. Under his leadership, the Algiers network has carried out over 50 successful attacks. "The French are learning," he says. "They're mapping us, cataloging us, trying to identify our support structures. We need to assume they know more than they actually do." He outlines new protocols. Cells will become even more compartmentalized. Couriers will use multiple cutouts, intermediaries who don't know the ultimate destination of their messages. Safe houses will rotate every few days. Bombers will operate completely independent of the network until the moment of attack. "They want to fight us as a network," Sadi says. "So we'll become invisible even to ourselves." It's a chess match played with human lives. The French are building a surveillance system unprecedented in colonial warfare. The FLN is constructing a resistance network that can operate even under total observation. Something has to break. October 15, 1956. 11 p.m. French paratroopers raid an apartment in Sector 7 based on intelligence from the new database. They're looking for a courier, a man identified as moving between known FLN sympathizers. They find him. They also find a problem. He's a schoolteacher with no weapons, no documents, no evidence of illegal activity. Just a man who happens to visit his cousins regularly. The arresting officer faces a choice. Release him for lack of evidence, or detain him for interrogation based on suspicious associations. He chooses detention. This becomes the pattern. Insufficient evidence for civilian courts, but suspicious enough for military detention. The suspect is taken to a holding facility where interrogation specialists will extract whatever information he possesses. The interrogation methods start relatively benign: questions, pressure, isolation. They won't stay benign, because the French are discovering that traditional interrogation doesn't work against a cellular network. The courier doesn't know the overall structure. He can only identify his immediate contacts. To roll up the entire network, interrogators need those contacts to reveal their contacts, and those contacts to reveal theirs. It requires time and techniques that push against every convention of law and military conduct. In Paris, the civilian government is uncomfortable with reports from Algeria. But they're more uncomfortable with the attacks continuing. They give the military increasing latitude to maintain order. That latitude will become a license for practices France will spend decades trying to forget. The schoolteacher breaks after 3 days. He provides 2 names. Those 2 lead to 4 more. Those 4 lead to 8. The network begins to unravel like a sweater. Pull one thread and others follow. Within a month, French intelligence will have identified and arrested over 200 FLN operatives in Algiers. The bombing campaign will slow dramatically. The Casbah will quiet. Colonel Trinquier will be hailed as a tactical genius who solved the unsolvable problem of urban insurgency. But victory comes with a price tag that won't be calculated until years later. November 3, 1956. Villa Soussaini, Algiers. The villa sits in a quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. White walls, bougainvillea climbing the gates, palm trees in the courtyard. It looks like a colonial administrator's residence, the kind of place where French officials might host garden parties. It's not. Henri Alleg is brought here in the back of a military truck, hands bound, blindfolded. He's a journalist, editor of the banned communist newspaper Alger Républicain. The paratroopers arrested him yesterday for subversive activities, writing articles critical of French policy in Algeria. He's never touched a bomb, never fired a weapon, never participated in an FLN operation. Doesn't matter. The paratroopers suspect he has connections to FLN sympathizers. They believe he knows names, safe houses, courier routes. They're probably right. Journalists in Algeria know things. They have to do their jobs. The question is whether he'll tell them. Inside Villa Soussaini, Alleg is taken to a room stripped of furniture except for a wooden plank and a water pipe. The walls are bare concrete. The floor is stained with things he doesn't want to identify. A lieutenant enters, young, maybe 25, the kind of fresh-faced officer who looks like he should be teaching at a military academy, not running an interrogation center. "You can make this easy," the lieutenant says in perfect French. "Just names. Who do you meet with? Who gives you information?" Alleg says nothing. What happens next will eventually be documented in Alleg's book The Question, published in 1958. The book will be immediately banned in France. Copies will be confiscated. Publishers will be prosecuted. Because Alleg describes, in clinical detail, what the French military is doing in places like Villa Soussaini. The technique is called la gigine, the magneto. It's a field telephone generator repurposed as a torture device. Electrodes are attached to the victim's extremities, ears, fingers, genitals. The crank is turned. Electrical current shoots through the nervous system. The pain is described as indescribable. Alleg will last 6 hours before he passes out. He'll be revived with water, and the process will continue. This will go on for days. He won't give them names. Some men break. Some don't. The lottery of human endurance under extreme duress. But Alleg is unusual. A French journalist with connections to metropolitan newspapers. His case will eventually reach the public. Most suspects aren't that fortunate. In a cell down the hall, a young Algerian named Larbi Ben Midi is being held. He's not a courier or a sympathizer. He's one of the FLN's top military commanders, captured 2 weeks ago in a raid that French intelligence considers a major victory. Ben Midi has information that could dismantle the entire Algiers network. He knows the cellular structure, the safe houses, the arms caches, the upcoming operations. The French need him to talk. Colonel Trinquier himself interrogates Ben Midi. Not with electrodes and water, but with conversation. Trinquier believes in the power of intellectual argument. He respects Ben Midi as a fellow soldier, even an enemy soldier. They talk for hours. Trinquier tries to convince Ben Midi that the FLN's cause is hopeless, that France will never leave Algeria, that continued resistance only ensures more Algerian deaths. Ben Midi listens politely and gives nothing. "You realize we'll win this battle," Trinquier says. We'll break your network in Algiers. Probably, Ben Midi agrees. But you'll lose the war. How? We have superior numbers, superior firepower, superior resources. Ben Midi smiles. You have all that and you're still here, torturing people in villas, trying to extract information from school teachers and journalists. Does that sound like winning to you? Trinquier has no answer. 3 weeks later, Ben Midi will be found hanged in his cell. The official report will call it suicide. Algerian sources will call it murder. The truth will remain contested for decades. What's not contested is that by late 1956, French interrogation centers across Algiers are operating at capacity. Thousands of suspects detained. Hundreds tortured. Dozens killed. The French call it interrogatoire muscle, muscular interrogation. A euphemism that lets officers sleep at night. The results are undeniable. The intelligence gathered from these interrogations allows French forces to map the FLN network with unprecedented accuracy. Entire cells are rolled up. Arms caches discovered. Planned attacks prevented. By January 1957, the FLN bombing campaign in Algiers has effectively ceased. The Casbah is under total French control. Trinquier's tactics have worked. But something has broken that can't be repaired. November 20th, 1956. Paris. Reports are beginning to filter back to metropolitan France. Not official reports, those are sanitized, approved through military channels. These are letters from conscript soldiers serving in Algeria, leaked documents, whispered accounts from returning officers who can't reconcile what they've witnessed with their understanding of French values. A young paratrooper named Jean-Pierre writes to his mother, "We're doing things here that would shame us if we did them to animals. I don't know how to live with this when I come home." He won't come home. He'll die 6 months later in an ambush, but not before his letter is passed among anti-war activists in Paris. The French public is beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. What exactly are their soldiers doing in Algeria? Are these the actions of a republic founded on liberty, equality, and fraternity? The government's response is to crack down on information. Journalists who report on torture are prosecuted. Books describing interrogation techniques are banned. Soldiers are ordered not to discuss operational details with civilians. The silence only amplifies the whispers. Because the truth is leaking out in ways the government can't control. Algerians who've been detained and released tell their stories. Priests who minister to prisoners report what they've seen. Doctors who treat suspects in military custody document injuries consistent with systematic abuse. The torture isn't a rumor. It's policy, and it's working in the narrow tactical sense. The FLN network in Algiers is devastated. The bombing campaign has stopped. French civilians can walk the streets without fear of sudden explosions. But the strategic picture is more complicated. Every Algerian detained creates a family that hates France. Every torture victim becomes a martyr whose story radicalizes a dozen more recruits. Every military success in Algiers pushes the FLN to shift tactics, to operate in rural areas where French control is weaker. The war isn't ending. It's metastasizing. And in France itself, a moral rot is setting in. Soldiers return home unable to talk about what they've done. Officers resign rather than participate in interrogations. Conscripts desert rather than deploy to Algeria. The French military is winning the Battle of Algiers. It's losing France. January 28, 1957. Rue de Thebes, the Casbah. Zora Drift stands in an apartment stripped of everything except bare mattresses and fear. French paratroopers are moving through the building, floor by floor, checking every resident against their database. She's been underground for 3 months, moving between safe houses, sleeping in different rooms every night. The network has contracted around her like a closing fist. Half the couriers she knew are arrested or dead. The bomb maker with chemical burns on his hands was shot 2 weeks ago trying to escape a raid. Youssef Sadi is still operating, but barely. The zone commander who once coordinated 50 cells now struggles to maintain contact with 5. The French intelligence operation has been devastatingly effective. Zora can hear boots on the stairs. They're getting closer. She has a cyanide capsule sewn into the lining of her dress. Insurance against interrogation at Villa Susaini. She knows what happens there. Everyone knows now. The stories spread through the Casbah like smoke, whispered in the darkness, impossible to contain. The French broke the FLN network. But in doing so, they've created something more dangerous. Martyrs, rage, and a population that will never accept French rule. The boots reach her floor. Zora closes her eyes and waits. The door bursts open. For paratroopers, weapons raised, shouting commands in French. She raises her hands slowly, keeping them visible. No sudden movements. Nothing that gives them an excuse. They compare her face to a photograph. She sees recognition in the officer's eyes. They know who she is. They've been hunting her specifically. Zora Drift, the officer says. You're under arrest. She doesn't resist. Resistance is futile and undignified. She walks calmly between the paratroopers, down the stairs, out into the street where neighbors watch in silence. This is her last moment of freedom. She knows exactly what comes next. But she doesn't take the cyanide capsule. Later, she'll explain why. They wanted us to disappear quietly. Taking the capsule would have been giving them what they wanted. I chose to survive, to witness, to testify. February 4th, 1957. Villa Susaini. Zora endures 6 days of interrogation. The French use every technique: sleep deprivation, stress positions, threats against family members. They show her photographs of arrested FLN members, some bearing signs of severe abuse. Help us, the interrogator says. Just give us names. Make this stop. She gives them nothing. Not because she's superhuman. Because the cellular structure protects itself. She only knows a handful of operatives, most by code names. She doesn't know safe house locations. She was always taken there blindfolded. She doesn't know Saadi's current whereabouts. The French are discovering the limitation of their intelligence operation. They can break the network, but the network was designed to be broken. Each captured cell reveals only fragments. The whole picture remains elusive. Zora is eventually transferred to barbarous prison to await trial. She'll spend 5 years there. She'll survive. Many won't. Meanwhile, 800 miles away in Paris, the consequences of the Battle of Algiers are metastasizing. March 15, 1957. National Assembly, Paris. Deputy Pierre Mendès France stands before the chamber and speaks the words the government has been trying to suppress. France is torturing in Algeria. The chamber erupts. Mendès France continues over the shouting. We have reports from soldiers, testimony from priests, medical documentation from military doctors. Our republic, founded on human rights, is employing systematic torture against colonial subjects. This is not speculation. This is fact. The government scrambles to respond. The Minister of Defense insists these are isolated incidents, bad apples, not policy. But the evidence is overwhelming. Too many sources. Too much documentation. Too many soldiers coming home unable to live with what they've participated in. General Jacques Massu, commander of the 10th Parachute Division, gives a press conference defending the interrogation methods. We saved lives, he says. We prevented bombings. We restored order to Algiers. Sometimes dirty methods are necessary to fight a dirty war. His honesty is tactical suicide. Because the French public doesn't want honesty about torture. They want deniability. They want to believe their soldiers are heroes bringing civilization to the colonies, not torturers operating in converted villas. Massa's admission opens a floodgate. Newspapers begin publishing leaked documents. The torture isn't limited to Villa Susaini. It's systematic across French operations in Algeria. Military lawyers produce estimates. Over 3,000 suspects have been tortured. Hundreds have died in custody. The number might be higher. Record keeping in interrogation centers is deliberately poor. April 1957. Demonstrations begin in Paris. Students march through the Latin Quarter carrying signs. Peace in Algeria. No torture in our name. Algeria for Algerians. The government deploys police to break up the protests. But you can't arrest an idea whose time has arrived. The moral foundation of French Algeria is cracking. The argument was always that France brought civilization, education, progress to backward colonies. How does torture fit that narrative? How do secret prisons and electrical generators square with liberty, equality, fraternity? They don't. And increasingly, French citizens, especially young people who will be conscripted to fight this war, are concluding that Algeria isn't worth the moral cost. May 1957. The Casbah. With Zora Drift in prison and most of the Algiers network destroyed, the FLN shifts strategy again. They can't win the Battle of Algiers, they've already lost it. The French control the city completely now. But the war is larger than one city. FLN operations intensify in the countryside. Guerrilla attacks on rural outposts. Ambushes of supply convoys. hit-and-run raids that force France to disperse forces across Algeria's vast territory. The French response is predictable: more troops, more resources, more security operations. By 1958, France will have 400,000 soldiers deployed in Algeria. That's more troops than the United States will deploy to Vietnam at the height of that war. It's an enormous commitment of blood and treasure. And it's still not enough. Because military victory isn't the same as political victory. France can control Algiers. They can win firefights. They can destroy insurgent networks. But they can't make Algerians want French rule. Every checkpoint is a humiliation. Every detention without trial breeds resentment. Every torture victim creates a family of enemies. Every military success requires methods that undermine the moral justification for being there in the first place. The mathematics are impossible. June 1957. Barbarous prison. Zora Drift sits in a cell with 3 other female FLN prisoners. They're not allowed books, newspapers, or contact with the outside world. But information still seeps in through sympathetic guards, through new arrivals, through the prison network that mirrors the street network they once operated. They learn that Youssef Sadi has finally been captured. The last major FLN commander in Algiers, arrested in September after a dramatic rooftop chase. The Battle of Algiers is over. France has won. But sitting in prison, Zora understands something her captors don't yet grasp. Winning the battle isn't the same as winning the war. The torture, the mass arrests, the systematic oppression, all of it has accomplished something the FLN could never achieve through bombing alone. It's made Algerian independence inevitable. September 24, 1957. El Bayer, Algiers. Youssef Sadi sits in a military interrogation room, handcuffed, bleeding from a head wound sustained during his capture. Across from him sits Colonel Trinquier, the architect of France's counterinsurgency victory. Trinquier should be celebrating. He's broken the FLN network in Algiers. Captured the zone commander. The bombing campaign has ended. Tourists are returning to the cafés. French civilians no longer flinch at abandoned packages. But he looks tired. You fought well, Trinquier says. It's not condescension. It's professional respect between soldiers. Your network was sophisticated. Your tactics were sound. Sadi says nothing. His silence is its own statement. But you lost, Trinquier continues. We control Algiers. Your cells are destroyed. Your leadership is captured or dead. What did you accomplish besides getting thousands of Algerians killed? Finally, Sadi speaks. His voice is quiet, measured. I made you torture your own values to death. Trinquier leans back. Explain. You won the Battle of Algiers using methods that horrify your own citizens. Every technique you employed, every suspect you tortured, every principle you violated, all of it is being documented. Published. Discussed in Paris cafés and university classrooms. Sadi meets Trinquier's eyes. You're a brilliant tactician, Colonel. But you're fighting the wrong war. This was never about controlling Algiers. It was about making the cost of controlling Algeria unbearable. You think torture will drive France out? We've been here 127 years. I think you can't sustain a colonial empire in the modern world using methods that belong to the Middle Ages. Your soldiers are going home, and they can't sleep at night. Your citizens are reading about Villa Soussaini and asking why French values stop at the Mediterranean. Your government is defending torture in the National Assembly. Sadi leans forward, chains rattling. You won every tactical engagement. Congratulations. Now watch as France loses the will to fight. Trinquier has no response. Because somewhere in his tactical genius, buried under maps and intelligence reports and successful operations, he knows Sadi is right. December 1957. Conscript Barracks, Marseille. Jean-Marc Bosquet is 19 years old, drafted into military service, awaiting deployment to Algeria. He sits on his bunk reading a smuggled copy of Henri Alleg's The Question, the banned book describing torture at Villa Soussaini. The book is making its way through the barracks like contraband, passed hand to hand, read in whispered groups after lights out. Jean-Marc reads Alleg's description of the magneto, the water torture, the systematic degradation. He reads until he feels physically sick. Then he reads it again, because he needs to know what he might be ordered to do. Around him, other conscripts are having the same crisis of conscience. These aren't professional soldiers. They're university students, factory workers, farmers' sons, ordinary French citizens forced to serve 2 years in the military. They're being asked to fight a war they don't understand for a cause they're not sure they believe in. I won't do it, someone whispers in the darkness. If they order me to interrogate prisoners, I'll refuse. They'll court-martial you, another voice responds. I'd rather face a military tribunal than become that. This conversation is happening in barracks across France. The army's moral cohesion is fracturing. Officers who served in World War II, who fought against fascism, now find themselves employing fascist methods. The cognitive dissonance is unbearable. Some soldiers desert. Others serve but refuse to participate in interrogations. A few commit suicide rather than reconcile what they're being asked to do with who they thought they were. The French military is discovering that modern democratic societies can't sustain colonial wars that require systematic human rights violations. The empire worked when citizens at home didn't know, or didn't care, what soldiers did in distant colonies. But in 1957, with mass media, with conscript armies, with universal education that taught French values before teaching imperial necessity, the old model is breaking down. January 1958. The Casbah. The bombings have stopped, but the resistance continues in subtler forms. Work slowdowns. Silent protests. Refusal to cooperate with French authorities, even when threatened with arrest. The French have military control. They've won the Battle of Algiers. But they've lost something more important: legitimacy. Checkpoints throughout the Casbah process thousands of residents daily. Papers checked. Photographs compared. Every Algerian treated as a potential terrorist. This is what victory looks like: an occupying army controlling a hostile population through overwhelming force. It's unsustainable, because you can't run a city, let alone a country, on pure coercion forever. Eventually, the occupiers need local cooperation, economic integration, some level of consent from the governed. Algeria is providing none of that. The French military can prevent bombings, but they can't make Algerians accept French rule. Every security measure reinforces the occupation, and every reminder of occupation strengthens the desire for independence. May 13, 1958. Algiers. French settlers and military officers, terrified that Paris might negotiate with the FLN, stage a coup attempt. They seize government buildings in Algiers. They demand that France commit to keeping Algeria French forever. The crisis brings down the French Fourth Republic. General Charles de Gaulle, the hero of Free France, the man who led resistance against Nazi occupation, is called back to power to save France from civil war. De Gaulle understands what the settlers and the military don't: Algeria is already lost. Not militarily. France has won every major battle. The FLN is fractured, its leadership imprisoned or exiled, its urban networks destroyed. But politically, morally, economically, the cost of keeping Algeria exceeds any possible benefit. De Gaulle doesn't say this publicly. Not yet, but he begins the slow, agonizing process of preparing France for Algerian independence. It will take 4 more years. For years of continued fighting, political turmoil, terrorist attacks by French settlers who refuse to accept reality. For years of negotiations, ceasefires that collapse, renewed violence. But the trajectory is set. October 1958. Barbarous prison. Zora Driff hears through the prison network that de Gaulle has offered self-determination to Algeria. Not independence yet, just the promise that Algerians will eventually choose their own future. It's a crack in the wall. Small but growing. She's been in prison for nearly 2 years. She'll remain here for 3 more. But she understands now that her side is winning. Not through military victory. Through moral attrition. The French military destroyed the FLN network in Algiers. But in doing so, they destroyed something more valuable: France's belief in its imperial mission. You can't sustain an empire when your own citizens are ashamed of it. You can't fight a colonial war when your conscripts refuse to serve. You can't maintain occupation when every method required to hold territory violates the values you claim to represent. Trinquier won the Battle of Algiers using torture, mass arrests, and systematic oppression. And in winning, he ensured France would lose the war. March 18, 1962. Avion-les-Bains, France. The Avion Accords are signed in a lakeside resort 800 miles from Algiers. French and FLN negotiators put their signatures on documents that end 132 years of French rule in Algeria. France has lost. Not on the battlefield. The French military never suffered a decisive defeat. They won the Battle of Algiers. They controlled the major cities. They killed or captured thousands of FLN fighters. But they lost the war that mattered. Colonel Trinquier, retired now, watches the signing on television from his Paris apartment. He's written books about counterinsurgency, taught courses on urban warfare, been interviewed as an expert on defeating revolutionary movements. His tactics are studied in military academies worldwide. American officers preparing for Vietnam read his manuals. The techniques he pioneered in Algeria, systematic intelligence gathering, population control, network analysis, become doctrine for counterinsurgency operations. But Algeria is independent anyway. Trinquier understands the paradox now, though he'll never quite admit it publicly. Military victory in counterinsurgency requires methods that undermine political victory. You can break the insurgent network, but the cost of breaking it makes the occupation unsustainable. He won every battle and lost the war. July 3, 1962. Algiers. Independence Day. The French tricolor comes down from government buildings. The green and white flag of independent Algeria rises in its place. The transition is chaotic, violent. Over 1 million French settlers, Pieds Noirs, some whose families lived in Algeria for generations, flee to France. They leave behind homes, businesses, entire lives built on the assumption that Algeria would always be French. Some don't leave willingly. Extremist settler organizations, the OAS, secret army organization, launch a campaign of scorched earth terrorism. They bomb infrastructure, assassinate pro-independence officials, massacre Algerian civilians in final acts of desperate rage. The FLN responds with reprisals. French settlers who stayed are targeted. Algerians who cooperated with French rule are labeled traitors, killed or driven into exile. The violence continues even after independence, because wars don't end cleanly. The wounds cut too deep. The casualty estimates from the Algerian War vary wildly, depending on who's counting. The French government claims 250,000 Algerian deaths. Algerian sources claim 1.5 million. The truth is somewhere between, and the exact number matters less than the trauma. An entire generation scarred. Families destroyed. Communities displaced. Torture victims who will never fully heal, physically or psychologically. And for what? August 1962. Paris. Jean-Marc Bosquet, the conscript who read the question in his barracks, returns to France after 2 years in Algeria. He didn't desert. He didn't refuse orders. He served, though he's not proud of everything he did. He doesn't talk about it. This becomes typical. French veterans of Algeria return home and simply don't discuss the war. It's too painful, too morally complicated, too wrapped up in questions about national identity and colonial guilt. France itself enters a period of collective amnesia about Algeria. The war is rarely mentioned in history classes. Films about it are few and controversial. The torture, the massacres, the systematic violations of human rights. All of it gets buried under decades of silence. It will take 40 years before France begins seriously confronting what happened in Algeria. In 2000, the National Assembly will finally use the word war to describe the conflict. For decades, it was officially called Operations to Maintain Order, as if a war that killed hundreds of thousands was merely a police action. In 2018, President Emmanuel Macron will acknowledge that torture was systematic, not isolated incidents. He'll admit that France used torture as policy, not aberration. But no amount of acknowledgement can undo what was done. September 1962. Barbarous prison now empty. Zora Drift walks free. She spent 5 years here, from age 22 to 27. The years when most people build careers, start families, establish their lives. She spent them in a cell. But she's alive, which is more than many can say. She'll go on to become a lawyer, a senator, a voice for women's rights in independent Algeria. Her story will be told in films, books, academic studies. She'll never regret planting those bombs. When interviewed decades later, she'll explain, "We were fighting for our freedom against an occupying power. The French called us terrorists. We called ourselves freedom fighters. History has judged who was right. But history's judgment is complicated. The FLN's campaign of bombings killed civilians, French men, women, and children who had nothing to do with colonial policy. The bombs didn't discriminate between oppressors and ordinary people trying to live their lives. Post-independence Algeria won't be the democratic utopia the revolutionaries promised. The FLN will become an authoritarian single-party state. Corruption, political repression, and economic mismanagement will plague the country for decades. The revolution succeeded. The dream didn't. This too is typical. Revolutionary movements are better at destroying old systems than building new ones. The clarity of resistance gives way to the complexity of governance. October 1962. Washington, D.C. American military analysts study the Battle of Algiers intensively. The lessons seem clear. Superior firepower isn't enough in counterinsurgency. You need intelligence, population control, systematic pressure on insurgent networks. They note Trinkier's successes. They study the cellular structure of the FLN and how it was broken. They develop training programs based on French tactics in Algeria. What they fail to understand, or choose to ignore, is that France lost. The military victory was real but meaningless. The political defeat was inevitable. The United States will repeat France's mistakes in Vietnam, using many of the same counterinsurgency tactics, achieving similar military successes, and suffering similar political defeat. Decades later, American forces in Iraq and Afghanistan will again study the Battle of Algiers, again focus on the tactical victories, again miss the strategic lesson. You can't win an insurgency through military force if the occupation itself is the problem. Some lessons have to be learned over and over, paid for each time in blood. January 1963. Villa Soussaini abandoned. The building where Henri Alleg and thousands of others were tortured sits empty now. The electrical generators are gone. The interrogation rooms are bare. Eventually, it will be demolished. The French don't want reminders. But you can't demolish memory. The people who were tortured here carry it in their bodies. The soldiers who did the torturing carry it in their nightmares. The knowledge of what happened seeps into the historical record despite attempts to bury it. Villa Soussaini becomes a ghost that haunts French-Algerian relations for generations. Every attempt at reconciliation has to confront it. Every discussion of colonial legacy circles back to it. The torture wasn't an aberration. It was policy, and policy reveals values. France discovered that maintaining an empire in the modern era required choosing between its republican values and its colonial possessions. You couldn't have both. Colonel Trinquier chose empire. He won the Battle of Algiers. France chose values, eventually, reluctantly, and lost Algeria. In the mathematics of history, Trinquier's tactical genius equals strategic failure. The perfect counterinsurgency operation that achieved all its objectives and accomplished nothing that mattered. May 1966. Fort Bragg, North Carolina. A classified briefing room fills with U.S. Army Special Forces officers. The film projector clicks to life. The title appears in stark white letters, La Bataille d'Alger, The Battle of Algiers. It's not a documentary. It's a dramatization directed by Gillo Pontecorvo, released the previous year. But it's so realistic, shot in such documentary style with non-professional actors in the actual locations, that it feels like recovered footage from the war itself. The American officers watch French paratroopers methodically dismantling the FLN network. They watch the interrogations, the arrests, the systematic intelligence gathering. They watch the insurgency broken through superior tactics and ruthless application of force. When the lights come up, a colonel speaks. This is what success looks like in counterinsurgency. Study it. Learn it. We'll need these methods in Vietnam. In the back of the room, a younger officer raises his hand. Sir, the French lost Algeria. They won the Battle of Algiers, the colonel corrects. That's what we're studying. But they lost the war. The colonel's expression hardens. We're not going to lose Vietnam. We have more resources, better technology, stronger commitment. We'll apply these tactics correctly. The young officer says nothing more. But he's thinking about the film's ending. The scene they just watched where, years after the French military victory, Algiers erupts in spontaneous protests demanding independence. Thousands of Algerians flooding the streets, unarmed, unstoppable. The French won the battle. The Algerians won the argument. You can't kill an idea with tactics, no matter how brilliant. September 2003. The Pentagon, Washington, D.C. The same film is screened again, this time for officers planning the occupation of Iraq. 40 years have passed. The technology has changed. The Americans have drones, satellite surveillance, digital intelligence networks that Trinquier couldn't have imagined. But the fundamental problem remains unchanged. How do you fight an insurgency embedded in a civilian population? The answer in the film seems clear. Systematic intelligence gathering, population control, breaking the insurgent network cell by cell. What the briefing doesn't emphasize is that France left Algeria. That Trinquier's tactical masterpiece resulted in strategic defeat. That every method shown in the film, detention without trial, harsh interrogation, collective punishment, undermined the political legitimacy of the occupation. The Americans will learn this lesson again, in their own way, at their own cost. Abu Ghraib. Guantanamo. Extraordinary rendition. Different names, same fundamental problem. Counterinsurgency requires methods that democratic societies can't sustain without corroding their own values. The ghosts of Villa Susaini haunt modern warfare. March 2018. Algiers. Zora Driff, now 82 years old, sits for an interview with a French documentary filmmaker. They're in a cafe in the Casbah, the same neighborhood where she once moved bombs through checkpoints. The streets are different now. Wider. Paved. The medieval labyrinth has been partially modernized. But the memory remains. Do you regret the bombings? The filmmaker asks. Zora considers the question. She's been asked it hundreds of times over 50 years. Her answer has evolved, become more nuanced with age and distance. I regret the deaths of innocent people, she says carefully. Every death is a tragedy. But I don't regret fighting for Algeria's independence. Under the circumstances we faced, with the means available to us, we did what we believed necessary. The French still call it terrorism. The French resistance during World War II used many of the same tactics against German occupation. They planted bombs. They assassinated collaborators. They targeted civilians who worked for the occupation. History calls them heroes. She pauses, letting the parallel sink in. The difference isn't the tactics. It's who wins. Winners write themselves as freedom fighters. Losers get written as terrorists. Algeria won. So here I am, a respected elder stateswoman instead of a criminal. The filmmaker shifts uncomfortably. And Colonel Trinquier? The French officers who broke your network. They were soldiers doing their job as they understood it. I don't hate them personally. But the job they were doing was wrong. They were defending a colonial system that had no right to exist. Their tactics were effective. They destroyed our network in Algiers. But tactics aren't strategy. They won the battle and lost the war because the war was already lost. You can't hold a country that doesn't want to be held. This is the lesson that echoes across decades. Trinquier's brilliance, the FLN's sacrifices, the torture at Villa Susaini, the blood spilled in the Casbah. All of it leads to the same conclusion. In modern insurgencies, military victory is necessary but not sufficient. You also need political legitimacy, and legitimacy can't be imposed by force. July 2019. Paris. A French veteran of Algeria, now in his 80s, attends a reconciliation conference. He's never spoken publicly about his service. Never told his children or grandchildren what he did during the war. But age has loosened something in him. The weight of silence has become unbearable. He stands before the audience, Algerian and French citizens, historians, human rights activists, and speaks. I was at Villa Susaini. I participated in interrogations. I followed orders. I told myself we were preventing terrorism, saving lives, doing necessary work. His voice cracks. I was wrong. What we did was torture. There's no other word for it. We tortured people, and some of them died, and I have carried that for 60 years. The room is silent. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not asking for it. I just need to say, we were wrong. France was wrong. The methods were wrong. The cause was wrong. And I am sorry. It's not enough. Apologies never are. But it's something. This scene repeats itself across France as the final generation of Algerian War veterans ages into their final years. Men who carried secrets for decades finally speaking, finally acknowledging, finally confronting what they did and what was done in their names. Some Algerians accept these apologies. Others don't. The wounds are too deep, the trauma too great. There's no collective reconciliation, no neat closure. Just individuals on both sides trying to find peace with an impossible past. December 2024. A military academy, location unspecified. Young officers study the Battle of Algiers as a case study in counterinsurgency. The same film, the same tactical lessons, the same analysis of how Trinquier broke the FLN network. But now there's an additional section. Strategic limitations of tactical success. Finally, 60 years later, the complete lesson is being taught. Trinquier's tactics worked. The French military achieved its objectives. The Battle of Algiers was a counterinsurgency masterpiece. And it accomplished nothing except hastening Algerian independence and traumatizing a generation of soldiers and civilians on both sides. The The real lesson isn't how to win the battle. It's understanding that some battles, won correctly, lose the war. That military force can control territory, but can't create legitimacy. That tactics without political strategy is just organized violence leading nowhere. The instructors show the film's final scene. Algerian crowds overwhelming French security forces through sheer numbers and determination, demanding independence, unstoppable not because they're armed but because they're right. France deployed 400,000 soldiers. They won virtually every engagement. They broke every insurgent network. They controlled every major city. And they lost. Because the Algerians never stopped wanting independence, and you can't occupy a country forever against the will of its people, no matter how brilliant your tactics. This is the echo that resonates through modern warfare. From Algeria to Vietnam to Iraq to Afghanistan. The same lesson, learned and forgotten and learned again. Victory isn't measured in battles won or insurgents killed. It's measured in achieving sustainable political objectives. And some objectives, maintaining colonial rule, occupying unwilling populations, imposing foreign governance on indigenous peoples, are unsustainable regardless of military success. Trinquier understood tactics perfectly. He never understood this. The paratroopers who mocked Zulu shields and spears learned too late that technology doesn't guarantee victory. The French officers who thought the Casbah was under control learned too late that control isn't the same as consent. Both empires, British and French, discovered that military superiority means nothing when you're fighting populations that refuse to accept your right to rule them. The battles become footnotes. The lesson echoes forever. The end.